A couple of weeks after the two big night actions and the loss of two of the Congo-class battle cruisers, the Japanese situation on Guadalcanal was getting quite serious. With the demise of their transports, the Japanese Navy had tried running in supplies via destroyers, but these took too long to unload and they were at risk of air attack on their way back north in the morning. Next, they tried submarines. This worked somewhat better in terms of the secrecy of the deliveries, as the submarines could unload all night quite happily and just slip away underwater during the daylight. But the subs were only just about bringing in enough food per night for the following day's consumption, around 20 to 30 tons. Getting that food to the front line was quite difficult, and the Japanese army was gradually starving. Neither the destroyers nor the submarines could deliver heavy equipment like artillery or tanks, but simply holding ground required more food than the submarines were able to deliver. So they came up with a new idea. It was quite fun. Take large drums, mostly oil drums, clean them up, fill them with food and other useful supplies that can fit in a 55-gallon drum. Unfortunately, turns out you can't actually fit a tank in a 55-gallon drum, even in parts. Then you tie the drums together with chains and ropes, load them onto several destroyers, then charge at the island at full speed, chuck the drums overboard, make a sharp turn, because the destroyer's not supposed to be on land, and run home. This would allow the destroyers to get away safely during the night, because they weren't stopping to unload, and the drums, at least in theory, would either carry themselves ashore, or if they didn't, at least hopefully when morning came, be found drifting close enough to shore that swimmers and men in small boats based on the shore could go and get them. The greater carrying capacity of the destroyers compared to the submarines, and their ability to arrive in large numbers, should in theory boost the level of supplies to the island and stabilise the situation somewhat. The task of actually making this idea work in practice fell on Admiral Tanaka, who, fortunately for the Japanese Navy, was one of their two top admirals, albeit he was a somewhat underappreciated character. Although, to say he wasn't happy about the situation would be something of an understatement. He recorded, we're more a freighter convoy than a fighting squadron these days. The damn Yankees have dubbed us the Tokyo Express. We transport cargo to that cursed island, and our orders are to flee rather than fight. What a stupid thing. For this, he was assigned 8 destroyers. 2, his own flagship, Naganami, as well as the Takanami, were fully armed. The other 6, Kuroshio, Oyashio, Kagero, Suzukaze, Kawakaze, and Makinami, would be carrying the drums full of supplies, and, to save weight, they would only sail with their 2 quad launchers carrying torpedoes. The reload torpedoes that they would normally have, expecting action, had to be landed in order to make room and weight for the supplies in the containers. Further south, Admiral Halsey had managed to scrape together a group of cruisers, so he didn't have to take his one operational battleship, USS Washington, in again. Further out from the operational area, there was the battleship North Carolina, as well as the older battleships Colorado and Maryland, but North Carolina might at best replace South Dakota in the carrier escort duty role, and nobody in their right mind was going to send slow standard battleships into the maelstrom of close combat at night in what was rapidly becoming known as Iron Bottom Sound. The force he'd put together was based at Espiritu Santo and consisted of the newer heavy cruisers Minneapolis and New Orleans, the older heavy cruisers Pensacola and Northampton, and the Brooklyn-class light cruiser Honolulu. Along with them were the destroyers Fletcher, Drayton, Maury, and Perkins. This force also had a new commander, Rear Admiral Carlton Wright, formerly of the USS Augusta, another cruiser. Officially labelled Task Force 67, which replaced an older formation of the same name that was now somewhat the worse for wear, the formation had been under the command of Admiral Kincaid, who had synthesised the plans of Admiral Scott, which he'd been working on before his death, with the lessons learned from the Japanese actions, and then adding into that the use of the new SG radar sets, he was forming a new night battle doctrine for the US Navy. The plan looked good on paper. Apart from anything else, it at least meant that the US ships would know what they were supposed to be doing, instead of just guessing amidst a mixture of silence and contradictory orders on the fly. Kinkaid acknowledged that the next fight was almost certain to be at night, and so SG radar-equipped destroyers would have to lead the formation. They would then find the Japanese and launch torpedoes, then break off and let the cruisers engage with gunfire at a medium range that was set at about 10 to 12,000 yards, in order to keep the cruisers out of what they estimated to be a 10,000 yard range for the Japanese torpedoes. Unless and until a chance to support the cruisers with gunfire presented itself, the destroyers were to stay out of the way, and then of course potentially come in to help. If possible, the scout aircraft that the ships carried would be dropping flares, similar to the Japanese Navy's night fighting doctrine, and if those scout aircraft weren't available, then star shells could be used, but the use of searchlights was forbidden in all but the most dire circumstances, since operational experience had shown that basically every ship that had used searchlights at night thus far had become a target for every other ship in the area. The new force was something of a scratch force. Ships had been spared or diverted from carrier escort duty, destroyers poached from various convoy escorts, and half the strength of the force had only arrived from Pearl Harbor a couple of days before, on the 27th of November. But at least the US Navy now had a cruiser-based task group in the Guadalcanal area again. Well, at least for now. And then in a move that must have seemed brilliant to somebody, Kinkaid was reassigned, and Rear Admiral Carlton Wright, who hadn't seen any surface combat so far in the war, and who had only just arrived, along with the USS Minneapolis, was given command right as news began to filter in that all the new night combat lessons would soon need to be put into practice. Task Force 67 was then set to 12 hours notice for sailing on the 29th, and they waited for the signal to weigh anchor. Thanks to Allied decryption experts, the US Navy now knew when Tanaka was supposed to make his supply run, although thanks to some confusion, probably resulting from the use of destroyers as transports, the intel officers passed a message to the effect that the Japanese force was to be made up of 6 destroyers and 6 transports. But in any case, the US force set out to intercept, passing through the Lengo Channel between Florida and Guadalcanal Islands, aiming to meet the enemy in the same gap between Savo Island and Guadalcanal that had seen so much action over the preceding months. On the way in, they picked up a couple of extra destroyers, USS Lamson and USS Lardner, who were nearby, having just escorted a bunch of supply ships. These were told to go and join the aft of the line after the incoming US task group almost collided with said convoy. Also en route, they received an update that the enemy force would probably be made up entirely of destroyers, although this intel also suggested that the destroyers might be trying to land reinforcements as well as resupply. Ironically enough, this meant that the US Navy was deploying to intercept Tanaka's force before Tanaka himself left on the final leg of his run. As Tanaka's force left, one of the Allied Coast Watchers spotted it and reported it in, the Coast Watchers being a system of human spotters that effectively worked as talking radar sets, who had been set up in various places in the island chain, often behind enemy lines, to look out for and report Japanese shipping movements. This was further confirmed by US recon aircraft. The US cruisers then launched their scout aircraft for some evening reconnaissance, with orders to land at nearby US bases once they'd completed their sweeps. In theory, the aircraft would then refuel and take off again to provide the flare drops in the night action, which also neatly avoided having fueled aircraft present on the cruisers' decks. However, as it turned out, contrary weather conditions would prevent them from taking off again in time that night, and they would take no part in the subsequent action. On the flip side, a Japanese recon aircraft spotted a supply convoy, almost certainly the one that Lamson and Lardner had just been borrowed from, and Tanaka realised that any convoy must also have an escort, and if there was an escort, it must be nearby, and if it was nearby, then it was quite possible that he might run into it, and therefore they could expect to meet resistance. However, unlike other Japanese admirals, not only was Tanaka prepared for this, but he'd already briefed his captains that whilst they might be on a supply run, if they came across enemy ships, they should prioritise destroying them instead of continuing with the supply run. The Japanese army might have disagreed with these particular set of priorities, but Tanaka was the one in command. He led his ships southeast between Savo and Guadalcanal, whilst the US ships were heading northwest, with USS Fletcher leading the 3 other destroyers that had actually been assigned to the unit, then the flagship Minneapolis leading the cruisers, this being followed by New Orleans, Pensacola, Honolulu, and Northampton bringing up the rear. Of these, all but the 2 oldest ships had SG radar equipped. Lamson and Lardner, of course, were tailing on at the back. As Tanaka passed by Savo Island, moving at between 12 and 15 knots, he prepared to deploy the supply drums. Meanwhile, multiple US ships coming the other way, at about 20 knots, began to pick up the Japanese ships on radar, but this was well beyond any reasonable gun range at night. The US formation tightened up and headed in, whilst the Japanese, blissfully unaware of the situation, started to loosen the supply drums on their decks. However, 6 minutes after US radar had spotted the Japanese navy, Tanaka's flagship spotted the US ships and ordered the rest of the Japanese destroyers to stop what they were doing immediately and prepare for action. A few minutes thereafter, the US destroyers, who were now only 7,000 yards away, asked for permission to fire their torpedoes, as one of the orders that had been issued at the last moment before sundown had been similar to those you'll have heard from earlier battles. No firing without direct permission from the Admiral, in this case unless you were below 6,000 yards and had a confirmed enemy contact. At this point, the 2 formations were about to pass each other, so a launch at this stage would have had the torpedoes running at the oncoming Japanese ships in a perpendicular direction, closing quickly and over the most optimal short range. But nothing came back. Minutes ticked by, and then Admiral Wright refused permission to fire, stating that the range was too long. In fact, the range was less than half the maximum range of a Mark 15 torpedo, something that Fletcher's Captain William Cole wasted no time in letting the Admiral know of, and which Fletcher's XO would later record as the most stupid thing I've ever heard of. More minutes passed, and eventually the order to fire the torpedoes came. Unfortunately, during the time from the initial request, the 2 formations had closed and were now actually passing one another, so the deflection needed meant that the US torpedoes, almost 24 of which were now in the water, were having to chase the Japanese destroyers, meaning both a longer run and easier evasion if the weapons were spotted, since the closing speed would be considerably less. Perkins, Fletcher and Drayton had launched all of their weapons, but Maury was the sole destroyer in the leading formation without any radar, and so she didn't launch as she had no enemy contacts. A minute later, Wright also ordered the US cruisers to open fire, which rather ruined the point of a surprise torpedo strike, since US torpedoes were still en route and, cruiser gunfire does make it rather obvious that enemies are present. The destroyers, in accordance with the battle plans, fired off starshell for illumination as the aircraft hadn't shown up, and then made off at speed to clear the firing lines for the bigger ships coming up behind them. The closest Japanese destroyer was one of the 2 fully armed ships, Takanami. US cruiser gunfire wrecked her in short order. Although she launched all her ready-use torpedoes before she was taken out of action, she would never get a chance to reload. The US ships, meanwhile, recorded her as an Atago-class cruiser, but never mind. The other 7 destroyers were accelerating, which also now moved them out of the predicted line of advance for the American torpedoes, and then began to swing about 180 degrees on a parallel course with the American ships, whilst laying smoke and salvoing off their own torpedoes. Within 10 minutes of the engagement opening, the first of almost 4 dozen long-range Japanese torpedoes were on their way. Despite having ordered a torpedo attack by his destroyers, Wright and a number of his captains do not appear to have considered that they were in reciprocal range of Japanese torpedoes. Perhaps they believed Buord's claims that the Japanese could never build a torpedo as good as an American one, and after all, the American ships, according to Wright at least, had been firing at the edge of their range. This proved to be a critical mistake, as the US cruiser line proceeded nice and steadily without varying their course and speed, and thus the Japanese torpedoes duly began to arrive, and two promptly blew holes in Minneapolis, crippling much of her propulsion and seeing the entire bow ahead of the main armament fold over like cheap cardboard into the sea. Whilst the next ship in line, New Orleans, was contemplating this, another torpedo arrived, and up went the forward magazine. Everything forward of the super-firing turret fell off as systems began to fail. One imagines an officer on the bridge looking down and thinking, I'm pretty sure the front's not supposed to fall off. The ship was about 15% lighter now, as that missing displacement merrily floated past, but what were now the forward bulkheads were not designed to be exposed to a racing sea, and the ship soon had to slew out of line. Now it gets even more bizarre. Having seen the two ships ahead take hits, Pensacola decided to do nothing. Simply maintain course and speed with a minimal adjustment to account for avoiding the reeling forms of the Minneapolis and New Orleans. Somewhat unsurprisingly, shortly thereafter, she was also hit by a torpedo, which set her on fire, tore off her portside propeller shaft, and left her without power and with a worrying list. Next up was Honolulu. Apparently, with Captain Halier being the only sane captain in the room, he accelerated to full speed and took evasive action, whilst sending enough 6-inch downrange to make Helena proud. Shockingly, this ship was not hit by torpedoes. The last cruiser in line was therefore USS Northampton, and for some utterly inexplicable reason, having seen the respective fates of the other 4 cruisers ahead of it, decided that clearly the best course of action was to imitate the first 3, and plodded along at the same course and speed as before, with a minor detour around what was now 3 slowing and burning ships, 2 of which were missing their faces. And thus, in a move predicted by almost everyone, Northampton was now also hit by a pair of torpedoes. They were spotted at the very last minute, and the ship tried to swing to port, but to no avail, the hits wiping out most of the ship's propulsion and setting the ship on fire as well. According to the damage report, the detonations occurred almost simultaneously, and the survivors generally just reported a single massive shock, and saw one combined geyser. The aft engine room and several other compartments were open to the sea, and a 10-degree list to port quickly developed. Both port shafts and the starboard inboard shaft stopped immediately, leaving them with just the one set of propulsion. All communications aft of the area that had been damaged were disrupted, and as fuel oil tanks had been in the path of both detonations, large amounts of oil were quickly redistributed into several deck areas they weren't supposed to be, as well as over the mainmast structure. Within a few seconds, fire broke out and unsurprisingly spread very quickly, this being fed by oil from the ruptured tanks bubbling up to the surface in the damaged area. The oil that had been thrown over the topside was also quickly ignited, and the entire mainmast structure served as a huge torch. This fire would never be fully controlled. To add injury to insult, New Orleans now opened fire on the 2 newly recruited destroyers that had been bringing up the rear, who decided that it was therefore best if they just left. Up ahead, the speeding Vanguard US destroyers found themselves in the strait between Guadalcanal and Savo Islands, and found themselves needing to motor on around Savo Island to come back in again to help out, something that would end up taking far too long and leave the same passage open for Tanaka. They could, in theory, turn round where they were, but that would leave them incredibly vulnerable. The opportunity was not something that an admiral like Tanaka would miss, and so, with a salvo of extra special goodbye torpedoes, the Japanese vessels motored away northwest toward home, leaving a couple of their number behind to try and help Takanami. But with Honolulu in the area, they decided that the abandoned Takanami wasn't worth risking themselves over, and soon thereafter they also withdrew. For the US ships, it was now simply a struggle for survival. Northampton's fight was not that long. The after-action report noted that efforts to control the list were futile, progressive flooding continued, and the list increased slowly. Transfer of ballast and remaining fuel as well as counter-flooding had little to no effect, and about an hour and 40 minutes after the torpedo struck, the ship was abandoned, except for the commanding officer and a salvage party. The list continued to increase, and when it reached 55 degrees, the salvage party and commanding officer also left the ship. Shortly thereafter, some 3 hours and 15 minutes after being hit, Northampton rolled over completely and, with the keel showing, plunged by the stern. Fortunately, the departure of Tanaka's force meant many of the survivors could then be rescued by PT boats and other craft that were based on Guadalcanal. The other 3 cruisers that had been hit did manage to make their way slowly to Tulagi, often not even making walking pace. Fortunately, Tulagi was not that far away, and the ships arrived with fires and flooding still aboard, assisted by 4 of the destroyers, whilst the other 2 went to help Northampton survivors. Aboard the 2 New Orleans-class ships, both were afloat pretty much only due to the heroic efforts by elements of their crew, a number of whom would unfortunately later be found dead at their posts, having foregone opportunities to escape in favour of completing vital damage control work, even as it cost them their last breath. Minneapolis still technically had her bow attached, it was just folded down almost 90 degrees and acting as a giant water break. Once safely alongside, Pensacola would be the first to be patched up and sent south for repairs. This took about a week. She'd been incredibly lucky. One of the torpedoes had hit a fuel tank, which had covered the aft of the ship in a wave of liquid flame, which had then dripped down into the hull and set off a number of shells in the aft magazine, once the heat had grown too great. Fortunately, they'd been relatively low-order individual detonations, occurring in sequence instead of a mass detonation of propellant charges, which had doomed other ships. The other 2 required temporary bows to be made from locally sourced coconut logs in order to keep the pressure off the internal bulkheads now exposed to the sea. These were relatively crude slab-sided affairs and not particularly pretty, but they worked. This took most of the next week, during which time the ships would also be covered in camo nets to try and keep the attentions of Japanese aircraft away from them. But they would also eventually make it to safety, although all the ships involved would need almost a year before their repairs and replacement bows were complete. Needless to say, the whole thing was something of a disaster, leaving the US Navy with only just over a dozen cruisers in the entire Pacific theatre. Initially, Wright claimed he'd sunk 2 Japanese light cruisers and 7 destroyers in exchange, which probably accounts for why he wasn't reprimanded. But, of course, it would eventually turn out that only 1 Japanese destroyer had been lost. Of course, this was at a time when American ships' torpedoes didn't work very well, and the US, including Wright, refused to believe that the Japanese torpedoes worked incredibly well. Albeit that after so many engagements with the Japanese ships firing torpedoes and sinking Allied vessels at somewhat considerable range, you'd think the tired old "submarines must have snuck in close" line might have sounded a little bit tired. But this is what Wright claimed in his report, even though it was fairly obvious from rangefinder measurements from the engagement that the range had been close enough that even some World War I torpedoes could have made it. 2 officers had previously separately called attention to the fact that the Japanese had superior torpedoes, Admiral Scott and Captain Rooks of USS Houston. But both of them were some time dead at this point, and their warnings had gone completely unheeded. Tanaka, on the other hand, had maintained that his victory was thanks to the training and skill of his men, although, as with so many other capable Japanese officers, he would shortly be reassigned to non-frontline duties for the crime of not winning hard enough. The one bright spot was the supply run itself had not been completed, and between PT boat attacks, air attacks, and the like, most further attempts to land supplies were mostly or entirely disrupted. Within a fortnight of the engagement, the Japanese Navy was advocating that Guadalcanal be abandoned, and by the end of the month, approval had been given. Only one last struggle would remain between the Japanese evacuation efforts and the US forces trying to close the net. But that's a story for another time.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.